Betty Broderick always complained she couldn't get a fair hearing in this town when her husband was alive. Now that he's dead, she is getting her day in court.
Dan Broderick and Linda Kolkina were happy newlyweds until his ex-wife, Betty Broderick, shot them dead in a jealous rage. Elizabeth Ann Bisaglia became Betty Broderick in 1969 after dating her boyfriend, Daniel Broderick, for 4 years. He was in medical school and she was an old-fashioned girl in pursuit of a college education. By all appearances, Dan was a young man on his way to the top. He was serious, ambitious, and focused on his goals. Although Betty wasn't religious, she had strong morals. As for Dan, he wasn't religious and didn't take their vows seriously. Betty seemed oblivious to this. Little did any of them know that at the time their marriage would end in a bitter divorce, that their 4 children would be caught between a cheating father and a distraught mother. Shortly after their marriage, Betty became pregnant with their first child, Kim. Their other children, daughter Lee, son Rhett, and Daniel Jr. soon followed. After Kim was born, Dan graduated from medical school and surprised everyone when he announced a new goal: law school. Although Dan's father paid for his son's education, Betty was working odd jobs to survive. For 4 years, Betty was having to find a way to support the family and keep her husband's nerves as steady while he struggled to make good grades. Betty considered it her job to keep her husband as stress-free as possible. As for Dan, at some point in his medical training, he began to realize that doctors can be sued by shady people with good lawyers. He became uneasy about having his assets on the line every day while he worked as a doctor to support his family. His new goal was to become a medical malpractice attorney. This way he could combine his medical and law degrees. It was not long before Dan was well known in the legal field. He hired Linda Kolkina in the early 1980s to be his receptionist. Betty's life was anything but glamorous after marrying Dan, but she never complained and supported her husband's ambitions.
We had very strict gender lines in our marriage. Dan went out and slayed the dragons and provided for us, and I was home and hearth and children and support my husband emotionally and through the good times and the bad.
And you enjoyed that?
I loved it. It's all I've ever wanted to do. The sacrifices that I had to put in were doing without my husband while he worked 14, 15-hour days and while he socialized after work and on weekends, and he taught courses to other lawyers. All of this was in the name of building his profession, building his name. And I had to do without my husband a lot.
Betty walked to the laundromat with her kids and planned meals based upon the discount coupons in the paper. Although she tried not to show it, Betty felt very lonely. At some point during law school, Dan became aware of what a good appearance can do for one's success. He had a nose job to give his face a more celebrity-like appearance and talked Betty into undergoing braces to fix her overbite. After 11 years of marriage, the Brodericks were finally beginning to gain some stability. Dan was a force in his field and was earning millions. Betty thought she would reap the rewards of hard work as a dutiful wife. Unfortunately for Betty, the feeling of contentment was short-lived as Dan began having an affair. Linda Kolkina was an inspiring mom and housewife, and she had found love in lawyer Dan Broderick while working as his secretary in 1983 at his San Diego law firm. Born on June 26, 1961 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Linda Kolkina was the youngest of 4 sisters. They were raised Catholic by Danish parents who had immigrated in the 1950s. Linda was only 11 years old when her mother died of cancer, and her father remarried shortly after. Raised to be housewives, the Kolkina girls were also taught that high school was the only education they needed. "Our expectations was to grow up and have children," Linda's sister said. "You work to work, not to have a career. We weren't cultured that way. The man would always be the breadwinner." In 1981, Linda Kolkina became a Delta Airlines stewardess, but was reportedly fired the following year for, quote, conduct unbecoming a Delta employee. Apparently, Linda and 4 friends were on an off-duty skiing trip when she and a male passenger were seen kissing and sneaking into the bathroom. After working briefly for an attorney in Atlanta, Linda followed a boyfriend to San Diego, California. It was here that the 21-year-old met Dan Broderick while working at his law firm. Linda had no experience in law and didn't even know how to type. Even then, Dan had no problem with hiring the young lady and giving her a salary of $30,000 per year. By now, Dan was earning more than $1 million per year. Dan Broderick financed 4 kids, country club memberships, a La Jolla mansion, a ski condo, and a Corvette. Oh, and a boat. His marriage began to sour when Betty overheard her husband tell a friend how beautiful his new secretary, Colkina, was at a party. The marriage worsened when Dan made Colkina his legal assistant a few weeks later, despite the fact, as mentioned, she could not type and didn't have a background in law. The two had long leisurely lunches together while Dan denied the affair to his wife. Meanwhile, colleagues and even Betty herself whispered about how Linda looked so much like a younger version of Betty.
Finally told her.
A lot of this was my fault because I was old and fat and ugly and boring and stupid. If you're old, fat, ugly, boring, and stupid, you try to be younger. And you go and try to get wrinkles taken off your face that weren't even there. You try and get your teeth fixed because I have one tooth that's a little tiny millimeter of something crooked, and I tried to be perfect. Absolutely flawlessly perfect for Dan Broderick.
It's like he just traded his wife in for a younger version of her. Meanwhile, Betty caught Dan calling Linda on the phone. When the family toured England, she discovered Dan had been telegraphing flowers to Linda. Betty did end up telling one of her closest friends about her suspicions. The friend told her to go into the office and make herself known. She brought a bottle of champagne and a dozen roses. She was going to take him out for a romantic birthday dinner, but when she arrived at the office, she found a party had already been had, and Dan and his assistant Linda had not returned back to the office after lunch. Betty peered into Linda's office only to find an old picture of Dan in her office, which to her was just one piece to confirm her suspicions. She waited around the office for hours to see if they would return, but Dan and Linda never came back. In revenge for the affair, Betty burned her husband's clothes and even threw a stereo at him, all in front of her children, who were crying. Betty told her husband to get rid of her by the beginning of October, or get out. The Brodericks had moved into a rental property after structural damage was discovered on their house in 1984. Dan eventually confessed to the affair and did not apologize to Betty. Dan lived in their home alone and didn't want much to do with the children, and so Betty forcibly dropped them on his doorstep. This would come back to haunt Betty later, as it would be seen as abandonment when she went to seek custody of the children. As you can imagine, Betty was already really angry, but when she went to visit her children, she was told by the housekeeper that Linda had dropped off a Boston cream pie, Dan's favorite. Betty proceeded to carry it upstairs to spread its chocolate contents across Dan's bed, once their bed, and his closet full of fine clothes were also smeared with chocolate. And immediately Dan had a restraining order issued to keep his wife off the premises.
And I said, look, if you don't stop harassing me, I'm going to withhold $200 for every obscene word you use, $500 every time you come into my house, and $1,000 every time you take the kids away without telling me in advance.
Infuriated by the order that forbade her to step foot in what she still considered her house too, she flung a wine bottle through a window. When Linda and Dan moved in together in 1984, Betty broke into their house and spray painted their bedroom. This wasn't the only time Betty was problematic. She also rammed her car into Dan's front door in 1989. And had absolutely no regrets about it. She said there was minimal damage. However, she was arrested and spent several days in a mental health institute. Betty said, quote, "I'd do it again, only I'd do it better. I was mad. He had just stolen everything from me," adding there was nothing loony about her behavior. With the drama between Betty and Dan, I'm not sure why Linda stayed, but I could assume. However, Betty later claimed that Linda was not without fault herself. Betty received an anonymous letter in the mail containing a photo of Dan and Linda with the words, "Eat your heart out, bitch." Betty blamed the stunt on Linda. She also thought that Linda mailed her advertisements for wrinkle cream and weight loss products. According to Betty, it was also around this time that Dan began to make comments about her age and weight, calling her old, fat, ugly, and stupid. I do want to add that Linda did break into Betty's home. She told her housekeeper that she was friends with Betty. Apparently, Betty had stolen her guest list, so she wanted that back, which I understand. However, she did steal Betty's journals and some other documents, so we don't know what exactly she wanted to do with those. When the Broderick divorce was finalized in 1986, Dan received custody of the kids, the house, and was required to provide Betty with an allowance. And as I mentioned earlier, in retaliation, Betty crashed her car into Dan and Linda's front door. She had a knife on her and was held in psychiatric care for 72 hours. Nonetheless, Linda Coquina was overjoyed when Dan proposed to her in 1988. Linda knew her wedding was at risk of turning into a nightmare. She begged Dan to wear a bulletproof vest at the ceremony. He refused but did hire security guards for the wedding at their mansion in April 1989. Like the Caribbean honeymoon to follow, it went without a hitch, but unfortunately it would all come to an end. At 5:30 a.m. on November 5, 1989, Betty Broderick used a key she had stolen from one of her daughters to enter the house of Dan and Linda Broderick. She brought a .38 caliber revolver she had purchased 8 months earlier and walked up to the couple's bedroom. Linda awoke, screaming. Betty fired 5 shots, hitting Linda once in the chest and once in the head, killing her instantly. Dan was hit once in the lung, and before dying he said, quote, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." Betty ripped the phone from the wall and escaped, only to turn herself in hours later. The trial of Betty Broderick began in the fall of 1990. Betty Broderick maintained she only wanted to kill herself and forced the newlywed couple to watch, but was startled into firing her gun when Linda Coquina cried out. However, the prosecution provided evidence of her intent to kill by playing messages she had left on the couple's answering machine. Betty Broderick was found guilty and sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life. As for Dan and Linda Broderick, their funeral was 5 days after their deaths and was held at St. Joseph's Cathedral, which saw over 600 attendees. Now, it is sad that Betty went through so much pain. She suffered 2 miscarriages, 2 abortions, and lost a child after birth, all while supporting Dan. However, I don't condone murder. I wish Dan and his wife weren't narcissists. It's like they got enjoyment taunting Betty. I mean, he got custody of the children, most likely to hurt Betty even more. She had been the main caretaker before this, and Dan didn't spend much time with them, but he was powerful and Betty wasn't. Now, why Linda would insert herself between the 2 exes is beyond me. I can only assume why she wanted Dan so bad. Dan did deduct money from Betty each time she, quote, misbehaved as if she were a child, but I don't believe Betty ever was upset over money. It was more so the gaslighting and his behavior in general. This provoked her. It is tragic it happened with the children in the middle of it all. Did anyone think to check on the children? I don't know. Maybe Linda checked on them. But anyway, do you think Betty's sentence was fair? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Lesson of the day, don't put no man through school. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. For now, take care and stay safe.